Hello, my dear Franken-friends, and welcome to Spookyou, your one-stop shop for all things ghastly and ghoulish. I'm your host, Barnabas Vixen, and welcome back to a series that literally nobody asked for. That's right, we've got our gremlins and geist combing through our back catalog, firing up the old Commodore 64s, and working night and day to churn these bad boys out. They've put their hearts and souls into it. Literally. Tonight we bring you the entirety of We Never Should Have Tried to Break into Mrs. Hudson's Garage by the ever-talented RoseKMorgan, uninterrupted and in full standard depth, for your constitutional right to enjoy entertainment to the fullest. Without further ado, I'll hand the reins off to our vivacious voiceover virtuoso to weave tonight's tale. Take it away, maestro, and I'll see all of you later. This is a bad idea. Melissa was right. This was a bad idea. We're still gonna do it though, right? I asked, my voice shaking. Fuck yeah, we are, Damien grinned. If it weren't for him, I never would have had the nerve to show up that cold January night. I don't think Melissa would have either. The three of us stood outside of Mrs. Hudson's garage, our black clothes and acne-ridden faces lit faintly by the glow of the moon. Damien shrugged his duffel bag off his shoulder and onto the ground. He knelt down, unzipping it as gingerly as he could. My eyes darted between Damien, who was rifling through his bag of tricks, and Melissa. Her eyes were fixed on the half-circle window above the garage. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing other than the tattered curtains Mrs. Hudson had always seemed to keep drawn. "Are you sure that's not her bedroom?" Melissa hissed to me. "What if she wants to let some air in?" And Damien stood up from his bag, a heavy pair of bolt cutters in his hands. They looked older than he did. "It's not her bedroom, it's like an attic or something. Besides, do you honestly think she's still awake at her age?" Without pausing for a reply, Damien walked up to the garage door and inspected the chain inexplicably slung across it. And then he got to work. Melissa and I watched for a few moments as he tried to cut through the thick, rusted metal of the chain. The grunts of frustration let us know that this wasn't as easy as he'd been expecting. Not wanting to embarrass Damien by staring, I let my eyes drift away from his struggles and back up to the window. My heart seemed to stop and then race to catch up on the missing beats. The curtains were moving. I was sure they had been still just moments before. Guys, oh fuck, I think... Jesus, Parker, would it kill you to be quiet for like a minute? Damien snapped, not in the mood for hearing what I had to say. "I've almost," he grunted, "got this." As he said it, the chain finally snapped, falling in two pieces on the ground. In that moment, I think all three of us realized that we should have thought things through a bit more. The sound of metal on concrete was unmistakable and loud. "We have to go, now!" I grabbed Damien's arm, but he shook me off. "Parker, it's fine. She's an old woman and she's indoors. Do you honestly think that she heard that?" There was a slight quiver to his voice, and I wasn't sure if Damien was trying to convince me or convince himself. Either way, I'd had enough. No, fuck this, I'm leaving. As I turned to leave, Melissa's voice was the only thing that stopped me. "Parker." I turned back around. "You're right. We should go." She said it quietly, almost embarrassed, as if she'd only just realized how bad an idea breaking and entering really was. "Oh, come on. That was the hardest part anyway." Damien looked back and forth between Melissa and me, waiting for one of us to change our minds. And when we didn't, his face fell. "Screw both of you guys." He sounded more hurt than angry. I felt a prickly sensation run down my spine as I realized just how close Damien was to getting into Mrs. Hudson's garage. I thought of what my parents would say if they knew I was out here breaking into our neighbor's house, and I made the final decision to leave. Melissa followed me as I went, and I hoped Damien would come after, but he didn't. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a wire coat hanger. I'm not his dad. And just like that, I'd justified leaving my friend alone. Melissa and I barely spoke on the walk home. I snuck back into my bedroom the same way I snuck out, up the tree next door, a very careful jump perfected through years of practice to my roof, and then through the window. Getting in was easy, but I didn't sleep well that night. I tossed and turned, head swirling with guilt over leaving Damien and trying to break into the garage in the first place. First thing the next morning, I checked my phone in the hope that I'd find a message from Damien. Maybe his heist went well after all. But when I checked, there were no new messages. He must be pissed. I tried to shove aside the requisite angsty teenage feelings welling up in me long enough to grab some pancakes and say goodbye to my dad's. Like every morning, I met Melissa at her house, but I didn't wish her a good morning. Without thinking, the first thing out of my mouth was, "Have you heard from Damien?" She hadn't heard from him either. If he isn't texting Melissa, he must really be mad. We stopped outside of Damien's house on our way. Sometimes Damien would get a ride from his mom, so not seeing him at the door wasn't much of a surprise. Melissa didn't seem too bothered by it, but for some reason, when I didn't see him there, my heart sank. "Do you think he's avoiding us?" I asked as we continued on our walk. Melissa laughed lightly, but didn't smile. "Wouldn't you?" Damien and I didn't have class together until third period, so I tried to put him out of my mind for the meantime. I didn't bother texting him. If he was mad, knowing him, he'd stay mad. The morning came and went, and before long, I found myself sitting in French class. Madame Martin entered as she typically did, a coffee in one hand and an iPad in the other. As she pulled up a presentation about conjugating air, or something like that, I wasn't actually paying attention. I looked over to Damien's desk. No Damien. My mind started to race. Maybe he was just running late, or maybe he got caught. Continuing to ignore the lesson on something that I almost certainly would someday fuck up on a test, I grabbed my phone from my pocket to text Melissa. Damien's not here. I slipped the phone into my desk so I'd be able to see if the screen lit up with a new message. "Parker?" Madame Martin called my name. Yes?" She sighed. "The question I just asked, Parker, what is the answer?" God, I hated when she did this. Anytime you weren't paying attention, you could be sure that Madame Martin not only noticed, but would put you on the spot. Most of the teachers at our school were nice, but Madame Martin seemed to really like embarrassing you in front of the whole class. She got some sort of weird thrill from it. It was kind of creepy how much she liked making students squirm. But for once, I wasn't paying attention for a good reason. Not that I could tell her that. I figured, I'm just worried about a friend. I think he might have been arrested because last I saw him, he was breaking into a garage. Probably wouldn't go over well. "Sorry, madam. I wasn't listening. My phone vibrated loudly against the metal of my desk, cutting me off and ending any chance I had of talking my way out of it. "Phone, Parker." Great. Not only did I have to give up my phone, I had to walk all the way to the front of the class to give it to her. I heard the quiet jeering of my classmates. I slouched my way to the front, my face turning red hot as I did. Before putting the phone in Madame Martin's hand, I caught a glimpse of the message preview on my lock screen. It was from Melissa. I tried texting him all last period. I haven't got anything but... "That will be all, Parker." I walked back to my desk, still trying to ignore the giggles. The rest of the class went by painfully slowly. It was hard for me to keep still at the best of times, let alone when I was worried about Damien. I tapped on the tabletop and my right leg bounced frantically up and down. "Would you cut it out?" I didn't even look up at the girl next to me. "No." She let out an and loudly scraped her chair across the floor, angling it away from me. Normally I wouldn't be so curt, but I couldn't help it. I stared at the clock above Madame Martin's smartboard, willing it to move faster. It didn't work. I didn't get my phone back at the end of the period. Madam said she wouldn't let me have it back until the end of the day. I thought that might be illegal, but I wasn't sure, so I didn't say anything. Besides, it's not like I wasn't complicit in any law breaking. Melissa and I had our last period together, English. She tried to get my attention when I walked in the room, and for a moment I debated going over and talking to her. Then I remembered the essay I still hadn't finished and decided against it. I shook my head no at her, and she tilted hers to the side and sighed. "You're already done with your essay. I'm not," I thought, hoping it somehow came through in my facial expressions. But instead of responding, Melissa turned away. Great. The period was uneventful. For a while, I was able to tear myself away from thoughts of Damien and focus instead on my writing. I didn't think my essay was going to win any awards, but my dads would probably be happy with it, and that's all that really mattered. That's all school was for anyway. Make your teacher happy, make your parents happy, move on to the next assignment. I stuck my laptop back into my bag and tried to zip it up, but I yanked it too hard and ripped the zipper off entirely. I stood dumbfounded for a moment before tossing the metal pull inside the bag. Whatever. It could hang open. I was so preoccupied with my zipper situation, I didn't notice Melissa had crept up behind me. Parker. Oh shit, Melissa. I wondered how much of the zipper thing she saw. I wondered if I looked like a dumbass. Probably. Why didn't you write me back? Oh, yeah, Madam took my phone. Melissa looked disappointed in me, but continued. Okay, so you have an Android, right? Yeah, I said, straightening up, backpack over one arm, laptop still sticking out of the open pocket. I don't like iPhones. I hate how the UI... Not important. She cut me off. Looking back, I don't blame her. What's important is that Damien and I both have iPhones. So what? I sounded a little defensive. I thought about saying, hey, I didn't mean to sound so defensive, but I was pretty sure that would just make me sound more defensive. So, she replied, scrolling through her phone, Damien had his location sharing on. She held the phone up, and it took me a moment to process what I was looking at. Damien, or at least his phone, was still at Mrs. Hudson's house? Melissa nodded. We have to go back. I said it without even thinking. I think Damien would have done the same for either of us. Well, probably. He could be kind of a dick, but he was a loyal dick. I know. We didn't bother waiting for the cover of nightfall this time. This time, we reasoned, we weren't trying to commit any crimes, just trying to find our friend. That's kind of the opposite of a crime, if you think about it. The first thing we saw when we walked up to Mrs. Hudson's driveway stopped us both in our tracks. The chain. The chain that we had both watched Damien cut through was back up. No, that's not right. The chain Damien cut down was rusted. It had been there for years and it had shown. The chain had been replaced. The new chain was thicker and shinier than the old one had ever been. It was pulled taut across the garage door. But the chain wasn't the only new addition. Melissa elbowed me and pointed silently to a brand new sign that had been stuck into the lawn. No trespassing. We stood in quiet contemplation for a moment, planning our next move. I was anxious, but if Damien was here, I wasn't just going to walk away. Melissa finally broke the silence. We should call him. I nodded and reached for my pocket. Fuck. I forgot to get my phone back. Damn it! Melissa barely reacted to my outburst, grabbing her own phone instead and scrolling through her contacts to find Damien. I hoped he'd pick up, but my hopes were dashed almost immediately. I hadn't realized that Damien had left his ringer on. I mean, who does that? But he had. Melissa and I both listened as the default iPhone jingle played quietly somewhere around us. There. She pointed towards the lawn. My heart sank as I looked out onto the lawn and saw the cracked screen of Damien's iPhone 6 nestled in the long grass. I watched it light up, Melissa's name on the screen. But Damien wasn't there. No trespassing sign be damned. I walked out onto the lawn to pick up the phone. As I reached down to get it, I froze. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, a jolt of electricity down my spine. Someone was watching me, and it wasn't just Melissa. I took a deep breath, grabbed the phone, and backed off the lawn. Parker? Melissa's voice quivered. I think we should go. I could tell by the look on her face that she felt it too. She snuck one last peek back at the house and then ran, and we didn't stop until we were back at my house. Neither of my dads were home when we got there, which was probably for the best. I didn't know what they would have said if they'd seen me and Melissa covered in sweat, gasping for air like we'd just run a marathon. I guessed it wouldn't just be, "Hey honey, how was school?" My bedroom was a mess. Clothes, dirty and clean, had collected in a pile on my floor. Realizing Melissa was going to have to come in here as well, I tried to shuffle some of the shirts and jeans to the side. I picked up a milk crate of advanced Dungeons & Dragons reference materials that Damien and I had found at Value Village from the middle of the floor. I put it on top of my bookcase, hoping the extra weight wouldn't make the whole damn thing fall over. Exhausted, I collapsed onto my bed. Melissa, the more fit of the two of us, was downstairs grabbing us each a glass of water. I wasn't being a great host, but Melissa had been over so many times she was practically part of the family anyway. I stared at the ceiling. I wanted to think of something to say to Melissa, an idea to try and find Damien, anything. But my mind wasn't thinking logically. Clear thought had been replaced with mild panic. So I did the same thing I'd done to calm myself down since I was a kid. I counted the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. 1, 2, 3. I knew there were 157, but that didn't stop me. And it didn't stop it from helping. 10, 11, 12. I got to 26 by the time Melissa finally came up with the water. I sat up. She didn't say anything as she handed me the glass. We sipped quietly, and I could hear her breathing, heavier than normal. I wondered if mine was too. I couldn't tell. It just always sounded loud to me. "We have to call the cops." Melissa's proclamation stirred me from my stupor. She was probably right. I had Damien's phone in my hand. Touch ID failed, obviously, so I put in his passcode, 6969. Obviously. Together, we looked through the missed calls. From Melissa, of course, but from Damien's mother as well. I realized now that we wouldn't have to call the cops. If she'd been unable to reach Damien, Miss Allen had almost certainly called them already. I heard a noise downstairs that nearly made me jump out of my skin. The door unlocking. "Parker?" "Hey, Pop." I yelled down to him. Then I heard a sigh of relief. "Hey, Mr. Charles." Melissa liked Pop. They were always pretty close. I listened as Pop locked the door behind him and then climbed the stairs to the second floor. I have a clear view of the stairs from my bedroom, and as I watched Pop reach the top, I could tell something was off. His normal smile was replaced with a frown and worry lines drawn deep across his forehead. As his eyes met mine, the worry shifted to anger. "Parker, earlier today Miss Allen called me. As far as she knows, Damien's gone missing. I tried to call you as soon as I heard, but you haven't been writing to me or Dad for hours." I felt my throat closing up. I hadn't even thought about what my parents would be thinking this whole time. I swallowed and it was painful. "I called the school when I couldn't find you. I left work early and picked this." He threw the cell phone at me and I almost caught it too. "Up from the school and spent the next 20 minutes driving around trying to find you." I glanced at Melissa out of the corner of my eye. Her face turned slightly red, embarrassed. For me? For herself? God only knows. Pop liked Melissa, but he hadn't even acknowledged that she was here. "Well?" Pop demanded an answer, even though he hadn't asked anything. "Pop, I stumbled through the words as I tried not to think about what I'd put him and Dad through. I tried not to think about what Miss Allen was still going through. "I need to tell you something, and I know you're going to be mad, but it's important. It's about Damien."
Jesus Christ, Parker! The living room of the Charles household hadn't been as tense since I had to tell Dad I accidentally lost his leopard gecko in the backyard. That was 7 years previous. I sat on the couch, arms pulled in tight to my chest. Pop, who had explained everything to first, sat across from me in the recliner. Silent. He was mad, but he was never really one to yell. Melissa had walked home shortly after he'd arrived. It was a painfully quiet half hour before Dad joined the rest of the family at home. "Go ahead, Parker," he'd said once Dad arrived. "Tell Dad about your big adventure with your friends." So I did. I could tell, watching him pace back and forth, that Dad had mixed feelings. He was happy I was home safe, but infuriated that I'd been such an idiot to begin with. I knew he was trying to stay calm, but it looked like he was having a difficult time. "So," Dad stopped in front of the TV. "Why exactly did you want to break into Mrs. Hudson's garage in the first place?" I thought this was obvious, but whatever. It had a big chain on it. Who puts a chain on their garage? My voice cracked as I said it, realizing that it was, in fact, kind of a stupid reason to want to burglarize someone. I scrambled for justification where, deep in the pit of my stomach, I knew there was none. Plus, the other kids at school said they thought she might be in, like, a cult or something. Oh my God! A cult? Dad's eyebrows looked like they were about to jump right off his face. Even if that weren't completely ridiculous, why would that make you want to... He stammered his way through the end of the sentence. In his defense, it was kind of a stupid accusation. Mrs. Hudson spent most of her time doing harmless old white lady stuff, going to church, volunteering at the local homeless shelter, and getting rowdy on bingo nights. I couldn't stand having either of them mad at me. As far as parents went, I was one of the luckiest kids I knew. I took a chance to try and win them back over. Well, if it makes you feel any better, my leg bounced, threatening to bounce me right off the couch. I was the one who tried to call it off. I knew it was stupid. Dad sighed. He stood a moment longer, rubbing his face with both hands. The silence was suffocating. Finally, he sat next to me. He put his arm around my shoulders and then kissed the top of my head. I could tell he was still angry, but thankful I'd shown some hint of sense. It was still incredibly stupid, Parker. I know. Being the one who tried to call it off seemed to win me some favor over with my parents, but I was grounded for the next month. The first exception was school, and the second exception was the search party. The searching started early the next morning. I headed out with my parents and Melissa came to join us. Dad smiled to greet her. "Are your parents coming too, Melissa?" Pop not so subtly elbowed Dad for his comment, and I caught him hissing, "David!" under his breath. I wondered when the last time Melissa's parents came to anything was. Both were officers, so you'd expect to see them at something like this, working, if not volunteering. They got the day off. She looked down at the ground, rearranging dust with the tip of her boot. It would have been fun if it wasn't terrifying. It's not often you see the whole town together, but the circumstances were grim. A cop I've never met barked orders at us, and we were split into groups to canvass different areas of the town and the surrounding forest. Melissa, my dad's, and the Carey family from across the street started our search near the wood's edge. "Did you see Mrs. Hudson's house?" Melissa whispered to me when the others weren't looking in our direction. "What? No. I think the cops went to talk to her this morning. I saw a cruiser outside." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. We spent 3 hours combing the forest. Melissa and I tried to stay together with my parents, but the Carey family wanted to branch off. I didn't have any issues with that. My stomach was in knots. It wasn't my fault, but I'd be lying if I said I believed that. I wasn't particularly close with the Careys, and I didn't need them watching me try to grapple with my guilt. I hadn't noticed from the bedroom, but it must have rained the previous night. Wherever we walked, the ground was muddy and gave way to our footsteps. After half an hour, my black Converse were stained brown from mud, decorated with bits of leaves and discarded pine nettles. If it weren't for the wet socks, though, I don't think I would have noticed. We were all too focused on the search. In need of a break, mentally and physically, I looked around for somewhere to sit. "Hey, Melissa!" I gestured to a nearby fallen tree. We took a seat. My parents didn't want to go too far without us, so they just kept looking in our immediate area. "I feel like it's my fault he's missing." Melissa thought my comment over. "I don't think it's your fault. Or my fault." She was taking her time, choosing her words carefully. "We don't even know if Damien disappearing has anything to do with, us trying to break in." As she said it, I wanted to say, "We definitely know that," but I knew she was right. It could just be a coincidence, though that didn't really make me feel any better. A wave of guilt washed over me. Was I really sitting here, taking a break and feeling sorry for myself? If I'm going to blame myself for Damien's disappearance, then at the very least, I should be committed to helping find him. I stood up abruptly, and Melissa was quick to follow.
We exited the trees into a small clearing. Even after the rain, it was beautiful. There were little blue wildflowers sprouting out of the ground all across the pale green expanse. A section of creek ran through it, lined with broad gray rocks. I'd been there before, but not in the last few years. I started absent-mindedly following along the muddy edge of the creek. It seemed as good a place as any to look. Melissa followed, but seemed reserved. "Parker, your parents are still back there." She gestured her head towards the wooded area. Her tone was measured, but she looked concerned. "I'm not going to go too far." It was true. I didn't want to put anyone through any more stress than I had already. I just want... And that's when I saw him, about 20 meters down the creek, sitting on a rock with his duffel bag by his side. I saw a silhouette that was unmistakably his. Holy shit! Damien! Melissa and my parents left my mind in an instant as I took off towards Damien. They'll catch up. This is more important. My damp shoes sank deeper into the sludge with every step, but I didn't let it slow me down. A few meters from Damien, I slowed to a jog, overwhelmed with joy, to the point where I struggled to speak coherently. A smile spread across my face. Where the fuck? What the fuck have you been doing? We've all been looking... The word caught in my throat as I slowed to a stop. Now only a few feet away. The smile faded from my face when it occurred to me that he hadn't responded to a single word that I'd said. He wasn't talking. He wasn't moving. Oh, God. I felt like someone had rearranged my insides with an icicle. My body understood what was going on before my brain could even begin to comprehend it. Damien? It was only as I spoke his name for the final time, my voice soft and broken, that I really looked at the boy in front of me. He was pale, yes, but he'd always been pale. His eyes and mouth were closed. He looked, for some reason, relaxed. Like he'd come to spend some time along the edge of the creek and think about life. His red shirt, no, his blue shirt, was wrinkled far more than usual. It looked like someone had pulled it over his head for him and not taken a lot of care in doing so. And it was stained with so much... something. I didn't want to think about it. It didn't matter if I wanted to think about it or not. It was blood. It had to be blood. There was nothing else it could be. I took a step backwards, away from Damien, away from Damien's body and from the duffel bag lying by his side. Seizing the opportunity to look at something other than my friend's corpse, my eyes locked onto the open bag. Damien's tools weren't what I saw poking out of the top. No bolt cutters, no coat hanger, no screwdrivers. Instead, the bag was filled with glistening scarlet viscera. All manner of organs and tissues that I couldn't identify stared back up at me. They'd been tossed in the bag in no particular order, a careless mess like the leftovers from a high school frog dissection. More than I had ever wanted anything, I wanted to scream. I couldn't. Nothing came out but quick, shallow breaths. I felt tears forming in the corner of my eyes as I backed further away, stumbling in the muck. It didn't take long for Melissa and my dads to find me. She'd gone to get them the second I started to wander off. The search was over.
Look, I know I said uninterrupted, but seriously, I need to remind you to support this author. Rose is incredibly talented and has more stories for you to enjoy on their Reddit page. You can also find them and follow them on Twitter at RoseKMorgan to keep up to date with everything they're doing. All right, I can hear you violently clicking the fast forward button on your VCR. Let's get back to the story.
Have you ever been to a funeral for a teenager before? Because I hadn't. Not until Damien died. 2 of my grandparents had died when I was younger, basically one after the other too. Those funerals were sad, sure, but I was young and they were old. It was painful, but it was natural. Damien's funeral was not natural. There's something so profoundly wrong about the death of a 15-year-old. Watching Elizabeth Allen stand up at the front of the room and eulogize her only son felt backwards. I hadn't realized that there were degrees of somberness until Damien's funeral. I thought it was difficult to stomach being in a room of mourners remembering someone who was 86, but Damien... His casket was closed. On one hand, that made me happy. He'd always said open caskets freaked him out. But looking down at it drove home that I'd already seen Damien for the last time. It seems obvious, but that thought felt like being kicked in the chest. I would never see him again. The last time I had, he'd already been dead. And the time before that, I'd abandoned him. The other kids from the school covered his casket with stickers, bands he liked, cartoon characters, all kinds of shit like that. Somehow, I missed the memo, I guess. There were Sharpies too, so you could write a message on it. I'd never seen anything like it, and I still don't know how I feel about it. I think Damien would have liked it, though. Like a fucked up yearbook signing. He might have said something like that, or maybe he wouldn't. But I feel like he would have. There were actually so many people in the funeral home, especially from school, that they had to open up an overflow room. They live streamed the service to the second room. I didn't cry at the service. I was all out of tears by that point. I just sat there in my itchy black suit, a dad on each side of me, trying to forget where I was. Imagining I was literally anywhere else, rather than sitting in an uncomfortable pew, listening to a preacher who had never spoken to Damien about how God was going to forgive him his sins and let him into the kingdom of heaven or fucking whatever. That made my blood boil. Not because I wanted Damien to go to hell, but because Damien had been a devout atheist for as long as he knew what the word meant. I was always more on the fence about religion, but it felt disrespectful. He knew what he believed, and it wasn't this. I said nothing. I looked across the room to Melissa, flanked by two other teens we barely knew. She had a box of tissues on her lap, but she wasn't using them. She must have been all out of tears too. The preacher, whose name I didn't know but who I already hated more than anyone I'd ever met, asked if anyone from the crowd wanted to speak, share a story, a memory. I said nothing, and as soon as I could, I got the fuck out. Damien's cause of death was officially listed as an animal attack. Well, for about a day or two. It didn't take long for word to spread about what the scene where Damien was found looked like. Animals aren't generally going to put your shirt back on after they tear you open. As far as I'm aware, they aren't going to put all your guts in a bag either. Parents were furious, not just Miss Allen either. My dads were pissed. Someone ripped that poor kid apart and we're just going to assume it's what? A really meticulous badger? I remember Pop saying. I remember that in particular because it was funny, but I couldn't laugh at it. Pop, fired up with righteous anger, saying the words, "really meticulous badger," stuck with me. It was hard to get the picture of Damien out of my mind. Melissa was lucky. When she'd caught up with me the day of the search, she hadn't come that close. I think she figured from my reaction that she shouldn't see for herself. What bothered me more than anything else was, well, probably the fact that someone ripped out my friend's internal organs and put them in a duffel bag. But after that, what bothered me second most was his face. I could still see it, clear as day. He looked so calm, so serene. Did he know what was going to happen to him? Was he scared? Maybe he was drugged or asleep. That was the one real point of hope for me. He didn't look aware, so maybe he wasn't conscious. God, I hoped he wasn't conscious. Parker. It took 2 weeks for things to get mostly back to normal for me. I thought it was going to take longer, honestly. I thought the people around me would be more aware of our loss. I thought it'd be something people wouldn't stop talking about, but once Miss Allen left the city, interest in what happened to Damien started to fade. I didn't know it at the time, but the funeral was the last time I'd see Miss Allen.
She's still alive. She just moved to Oregon to live with her sister. Parents were still on edge, of course, but when it came to people my age, anyone who wasn't close to Damien seemed to forget about him just as quickly as they'd taken interest. Just another point in the news cycle. And when I say things were mostly back to normal, I mean that if someone were to watch me going about my day, it would look normal. I talked to my parents, I went to school, I did my homework. I went to therapy twice a week with a nice woman named Miss Cody. On the weekend, I slept in. Parker. I groaned into my pillow. I didn't know what Dad wanted, but I really didn't feel like getting up. Melissa is here. With a Herculean effort, I pulled myself away from my soft haven to look at Dad in the doorway. I craned my neck to try and see behind him. She's downstairs. As he leaned on the doorframe, there was a softness to his voice that I didn't quite understand. I didn't know why Melissa had come here I checked the clock. 11 a.m. on a Sunday, but I couldn't imagine it was without a cause. Our friendship had been strained since Damien's death. I'd heard that a lot of times tragedy can bring people together, but it seemed to have driven a wedge between the two of us. We hadn't walked together since the day Damien was found. I'd texted her once, but she never wrote back, and I wanted to give her space. I changed into actual clothes, not just boxers, and then I walked downstairs. Melissa didn't look herself. Her eyes were shadowed by heavy bags, and her hair was pulled back in a greasy ponytail. She was clearly not wearing makeup, which was unlike her. Hell, even at the funeral, she'd had winged eyeliner. As I stepped off the stairs, I was embraced in a hug I wasn't expecting. I actually stumbled backwards and needed a moment to balance. Melissa isn't particularly heavy, I just didn't see it coming. I hugged back. I felt her shaking gently under my arms as I stood there, not knowing what to do next. Soon, she pulled away and looked up at me. "Do you want to go get ice cream?" I didn't want to go get ice cream, not even a little bit. It wasn't even warm out yet. We were still in that part of a Canadian spring where it feels like winter until noon. I didn't know where she expected to go. Dairy Queen hadn't even opened for this season. Yeah, I do. My parents made a fourth exception to my grounding. We went for ice cream at a place called Spookyou's, which is a wildly stupid name. I didn't know it existed, tucked away in the corner of one of our town's small dying malls. Before going, if you had asked me what the storefront was, I would have said it was a Subway. I think it used to be a Subway. Melissa dug her spoon into her cup of vanilla ice cream, but didn't eat any. She just moved it around like she was going to conduct some sort of ice cream-based science experiment. Eventually, she gave up altogether and set the spoon down. I want to go back to Mrs. Hudson's house. Whatever I had been expecting Melissa to say, it sure as hell wasn't that. I would have set my own ice cream down, but I got a cone, so I just held it next to my face like an idiot. What? I want to go back. She was louder the second time, more confident. That's... I stuttered for a moment, pausing to lick a drop of stray ice cream. You're the one who told me the cops checked it out. Why would we go back there? I didn't realize I was getting flustered until I heard my voice rise. I know, but... She swept her eyes around the ice cream shop, making sure no one was listening. Thankfully, there were no other customers and the clerk had retreated to the back. They only went into her main hallway. She said she wasn't even in the city when it happened and that there's no way she was involved, but if she wasn't home, then how... Could the chains have been replaced? I finished her question with a whisper. I didn't know what Mrs. Hudson's deal was, but clearly she was lying. But wait, they? Yeah, you know, like the cops. Surely the police would double-check her whereabouts. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I was kidding myself if I thought the local PD was going to harass an old woman over the details of her alibi. If they couldn't even be bothered to immediately recognize the case as a murder, what were the odds they'd do a decent job investigating it? I felt a lump form in my throat as I realized that Melissa was right. If the police weren't doing their job, we couldn't just sit by and watch, right? Wait. I straightened up in my seat. How do you even know that? She looked down at her ice cream. It had mostly melted by this point. I asked my mom about it. And she told you? Like, actually told you? I was incredulous.
Melissa's mother never did anything for her, let alone something of this magnitude. She could get fired if someone finds out. Well, I thought she could anyway. I didn't really know what cops were and weren't allowed to do. A lot of the time, it seemed like they were allowed to do pretty much whatever they wanted. I guess she thought it would shut me up. She smiled wistfully down at her ice cream soup. That's worth the threat of job loss, right? I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. It was a prime example of a question with no right answer. So, what's the plan? The plan, as Melissa conceived it, was to make a second go at our robbery operation. We'd break into the garage, no backing out this time. Whatever Damien had seen, we'd see. Obviously, it would be harder now, considering the one person with the tools and experience was also the one no longer with us. We'd need to source a new set of bolt cutters, and we'd need to practice with them. And with using a wire hanger to pop the garage door mechanism. When we discussed the plan, we discussed it in terms of successes. We would get the bolt cutters. We would get in. We would figure out what the cops hadn't, and we wouldn't get caught. It quickly became an unspoken rule to not consider what might happen if we failed. In all honesty, it made it harder to plan, but neither of us could bring ourselves to think about the consequences of failure for very long. Step 1 was easy: acquire our tools. I decided to do exactly what Damien had done. Get a duffel bag, fill it with all the shit that I might need. A couple of wire hangers, tape, a spare phone battery pack, gloves for the both of us, cookies, one heavy metal hammer each, the reason for which was left unsaid. The one thing I didn't get was a flashlight. We assumed our phone lights would be enough. Melissa got the bolt cutters. We talked it over and figured that she'd raise less suspicion at the hardware store, right across from the Scoopies, than I would. People get it in their heads that teen girls are more responsible than teen boys for some reason. In my experience, we're about equally terrible. Initially, the plan was to steal the bolt cutters, but they were too big to hide, so she just bought them. We split the cost. Step 2 was harder. We had everything we needed, but if we showed up to Mrs. Hudson's house now, we'd never get into the garage. Neither of us had practice with the bolt cutters, and neither of us had popped open a garage door before. We practiced with the bolt cutters on bike locks from the dollar store. Those we did steal. Sorry, dads. If my allowance was higher, this wouldn't have been a problem. Gradually, we moved up to trying to saw away at a metal fence post in my backyard, one in the corner so I didn't get in shit. It's not a particularly complex task, but I couldn't get the hang of it the way Melissa did. We decided that when the night came, she'd do the cutting. Practicing opening the garage door itself was trickier. My house didn't have a garage, so that was a non-starter. We thought about trying it on Melissa's garage, but her parents had installed one of those video doorbells after a bike theft the previous year. It was Melissa's job to make sure that it was charged, so I suggested we put it on the charger while we practiced. Typically, she would charge it during the day since there was less of a risk that they'd need it then. We thought it would look suspicious for her to suddenly change her routine to charging at night, so we abandoned that idea. In the end, we just watched a bunch of people do it on YouTube until we were mostly confident we were able to pull it off. We set a date to do it. 3 a.m., the morning of March 14th. It was a Saturday that year. At first, the planning had invigorated us. The first thing since Damien died that we could throw ourselves into. I didn't say anything to Melissa, but in the week leading up to it, I felt my confidence waning. Walking into school Friday morning, I felt like a death row prisoner a day from execution. The sights and sounds of the hallways dulled around me. I tried to take them in, appreciate them, hope that this wouldn't be the last time that I saw them, but I couldn't process them over my heart beating in my ears. Part of me thought it was funny that I was desperately longing to see high school again. A larger part didn't. In French class, I stared at Damien's seat. No one else had been moved there. Madame Martin didn't even bother trying to shame me into paying attention anymore. I was sure I'd be back in her class next semester, assuming I came back at all. Melissa and I walked home together after school. I was surprised how chatty she was. She'd been working on an art project that she hadn't finished yet, but she wanted to tell me all about it. It was some sort of sculpture, but painted like an Aboriginal dot painting instead of solid colors. I couldn't really picture it, but I was glad to listen. When we got to the end of her driveway, Melissa gave me a quick hug and whispered in my ear, "See you at 3." She bounded into the house. Clearly, she was doing better than I was. I went to bed early that night, leaving dinner half finished on the table. I told my parents that I'd been feeling ill all day. I wasn't the best liar, more talented at lying by omission than lying outright. So it helped that I actually had felt ill all day, just not for the reason they might have assumed. My alarm set for 2:30 a.m., I crawled into bed. The duffel bag filled with all the supplies I'd need was tucked neatly underneath, ready to go as soon as I was. I tossed and turned from side to side for a bit before giving up and lying on my back, and I stared up at the plastic stars. 1, 2, 3. I got to 146 before I fell asleep. This is a bad idea. I couldn't imagine Melissa finding it encouraging, but I said it anyway. Once again, we found ourselves at the end of Mrs. Hudson's empty driveway. I knew this was the last chance either one of us had to back down. One final opportunity to run away, to try and forget about Damien and move on with our lives. I know. Melissa cracked her knuckles, just like they do in the movies. I bet she thought she looked pretty cool, and she was right. Her hair wound up in a tight bun as slick and professional as a 15-year-old could manage. Over the last few weeks, she'd really started to get her shit back together. It was true for both of us, really. We'd found a purpose again. Let's get started. I dropped the duffel bag and Melissa knelt to unzip it. She wasn't as careful or quiet as Damien had been, but it didn't seem to make a difference. I was the lookout as Melissa got to work. I scanned the road and then looked back to the house, my eyes locked on the window above the garage. This time, the curtains were still. It took Melissa even longer to cut the chain than I had expected. I bounced up and down quietly as I waited. When a car turned up onto the street, I tapped Melissa on the shoulder to get her attention. We both scampered to the side of the garage, kneeling there until it passed. While we crouched, she whispered that she was almost done. We crept back to the garage, Melissa armed with her bolt cutter. We had found a way around letting the metal chain smash to the ground, but it was more awkward in practice than in theory. Reaching over her head, I grabbed a hold of a side of the chain in each hand as Melissa finished the job. It was heavy and I almost dropped them, but I steadied myself and set the chain gently on the ground. It scraped slowly along the concrete as it settled into place, but it wasn't nearly as loud as letting it fall. Instinctively, I stepped backwards, checking on the window. No movement so far. I listened for movement inside the house, but all I could hear was the dull throbbing of my own pulse. Melissa backed away from the garage door, wiping the sweat off her forehead. She returned the cutters to the duffel bag, pulling out a metal coat hanger and handing it to me. Now, it was her turn to keep watch, though she didn't need to watch for long. Disengaging the garage door's safety release was even easier than the YouTube videos had made it look. Less than a minute later, I tucked the hanger back into the bag. I zipped it up and slung it over my shoulder, and I looked over at Melissa and we nodded to each other. We reached down to the bottom of the garage, and together, hearts pounding like jackhammers, we rolled it up. I couldn't see anything, not at first. My eyes needed time to adjust. The first sense of mine that kicked into high gear was smell. It wasn't horrible, no overwhelming scent of rotting flesh, no metallic scent of blood. It just smelled like a barn. In tandem, Melissa and I reached for our pockets and grabbed our cell phones, lighting the flashlights to get a better look around. The garage didn't just smell like a barn, it looked like a barn. The floor was coated in shredded newspapers, thin strips of fabric, and honest-to-God hay. I took a step forward into the mess to find just how deep it was. Past my ankles. Gross. What the fuck is this? I heard Melissa whisper behind me. Hell if I know. We swept our lights across the room. For such a large garage, it was mostly empty. Sure, the floor was 6 inches of concentrated muck, but there weren't the toolboxes and recycling bins that you'd expect. The most prominent features were an upright freezer in the back right corner and a metal shelf filled with mason jars along the left wall. I took an uneasy step toward the jars and then another. Something deep inside me told me that they weren't going to be full of pasta sauce. Steeling myself for what I might see, I took a slow breath before angling the light up at the jars. For a moment, I thought I might have been wrong about the pasta sauce. All of the jars were filled with a red fluid in any case. The way the light shone through the glass and its contents gave me the impression that it was something viscous, and I was confident in my guess of what it might be. I felt my insides squirm as I tried not to think too hard about where it came from. Worse still was the crimson-stained baby bottle sitting next to the jars. I tried not to dwell on the questions that raised. It was then that I noticed that the jars were labeled, and I wanted to get a closer look. With a shaky hand, I reached for one on the bottom shelf, and I almost dropped it when I heard the sound of the freezer opening in the corner. Fuck! Sorry. Melissa sounded like she meant it. The open freezer had an inbuilt light, making our surroundings a bit clearer at the expense of scaring me half to death. Regaining my composure, I angled the flashlight towards the jar I'd picked up. The label was a piece of masking tape, handwritten letters spelling out a date. January 12th. Oh shit. I turned towards the glow of the open freezer. I think this blood is... Melissa? Melissa's face was pale as she stared into the icebox. Her eyes were wide and her jaw slack, jar in one hand and phone in the other. I trudged through the debris to see what had spooked her. As I came up beside her, she choked out one word. Hearts. Hearts. 6 neatly stacked blue and clear Tupperware containers, each containing a single mass of muscle. In truth, it wasn't as gory as it sounds. Clearly, care had been taken to package each heart away. Like the blood, each container had its own handwritten label on the front. My eyes searched across the containers until... there it was, right on top. January 12th. Pictures. Melissa sounded hoarse. What? Pictures, Parker. We need pictures, and we need to get the hell out of here. To this day, I'm thankful Melissa was able to pull herself together and think straight. I think if she hadn't... I don't know. But I don't think I would have remembered to take photos. I think I would have just left. We silently snapped photos of the blood, the hearts, the messy floor, and the crate. The crate. I hadn't seen it coming in, but I don't know how I missed it. It was about 2 cubic feet, nestled in the mess near the freezer. I knelt down beside it, trying to brace myself for whatever fresh, gory mess undoubtedly lay within, and flipped off the lid. The thing in the crate screamed. I screamed. Stop screaming! Melissa screamed. Staring up at me was a baby animal, but it looked unlike any baby animal I had ever seen. No, that wasn't entirely correct. It looked like multiple baby animals that I had seen, mashed into one. Something a taxidermist with a sick sense of humor might cobble together on a slow day. Its head was like a melanistic deer's, complete with tiny black antler nubs. The back half of it looked like a huge baby bird, black, wrinkled skin, wings and all. Its front legs bucked at the side of the crate in distress, and it flapped its wings uselessly. Its mouth was open in distress, showcasing an incomplete set of knife-like teeth. Its clawed hind legs scratched the wood. It would have almost been cute if it weren't for the screaming. The unmistakably human screaming. I threw the lid back on the crate, but it was too late. The creature was awake, and it had no intentions of falling back asleep. Melissa came up behind me and grabbed the back of my shirt, but I didn't need the encouragement. I was up on my feet and running towards the garage door in an instant. Together, we threw the door open. Maybe we should have closed it behind us, but we didn't. We just ran. I lagged behind Melissa by a good 2 meters. I had a vague idea that I wanted to get back to my house. I knew it was closer than Melissa's, but mostly, I wanted to run until I couldn't hear the screaming anymore. My feet ached from smacking flat against the pavement over and over again, and my chest burned from the combination of my lungs and heart working overtime. I stumbled as I turned the corner onto my street, wiping out onto the sidewalk, scraping my knees and tearing my jeans. They stung, and I cursed. Melissa slid to a stop and came back for me, reaching down to yank me from the concrete. As I got back on my feet, I heard it. Another scream, louder this time and more shrill than the first. This one didn't come from the direction of Mrs. Hudson's. I couldn't pinpoint where it originated, but I could tell it was somewhere above us. The scream was not coming from the baby thing in Mrs. Hudson's garage. It was coming from something larger. Melissa and I started moving again. We'd almost made it back to my house, which was a blessing because any longer and I was sure my lungs would have ruptured inside my chest. No way in hell was I going to try and climb the tree to get back in. It would be too much of a pain to show Melissa where to step. Sneaking in took time, something I feared we were running terminally low on. We dashed past the van in the driveway and onto my porch as another scream tore through the cool night air. My fingers like jelly, I fumbled for my keys. I missed the lock twice from shaking. Exasperated, Melissa snatched the keyring out of my hand, jamming the key into the lock with her first try. Click. I threw myself against the door, nearly falling into the house, and Melissa scrambled in after me and slammed the door behind us as the alarm began to blare. I punched the code in to silence it, then slumped on the floor. Her back against the door, Melissa slid down to join me. Frantic footsteps beat on the upper level.
Park, Melissa?
Dad's voice rang out as Pop turned on the lights. A moment later, both men were standing at the top of the staircase.
What the hell is going on?
I tried to find the words to say, but nothing came to me. What the hell was I supposed to say? Hey, Dad. Hey, Pop. You know how my friend got mysteriously gored to death after we tried to break into an old woman's garage? Well, Melissa and I went back and did it a second time. This time, we got in, and long story short, I think there's something out there in the night that wants to kill us now.
Melissa?
Pop asked. He probably figured I didn't feel like talking. Melissa didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, the four of us lapsed into a silence. I have to call my parents. Melissa finally spoke as she stood, leaving me alone on the floor. She walked to the kitchen and I heard the gentle beeping of the dialer on the phone. Now it was just me and my parents.
Parker.
Pop's voice was a mixture of all the things I hated to hear the most. Fear, worry, and disappointment. Dad didn't say anything. That was even worse. I know this probably looks bad, but I can explain, honestly. Oh, thank God. For once, I had evidence. I even have photos on my phone that I can show you. Pop, still standing at the top of the stairs, still half awake, ran his hand through his hair.
Photos of what?
Parker, we still have no idea where you were. I gritted my teeth. This was going to be the hard part. I really think I should show you first. I'll explain later. After a moment's pause, Pop sighed and began to descend the stairs. Dad, on the other hand, didn't seem convinced. I realized the silent treatment probably wasn't going anywhere fast. I thought I'd lost my phone as I felt my pocket, and a burst of anxiety reduced me to a shaky mess. I hadn't lost it, though. For whatever reason, I'd put it in the wrong pocket. When I realized it was still there, I breathed a sigh of relief. The photos were there, too. Undeniable proof that something horrible was going on in Mrs. Hudson's garage. Pop squinted at the first of the pictures as I held the phone up for him to see.
Is this tomato sauce? Did you sneak out to go canning?
No! I snapped back. Pop's eyes narrowed at my tone. I'm sorry, I mean, no, it's not tomato sauce. It's blood, trust me, and... I swiped to the left. There's more. Pop stared at the photo of the hearts. For a moment, it seemed like he was trying to figure out how to justify the image to himself, to come up with an explanation other than the obvious, but he couldn't. His hand went to his face, rubbing his eyes as if there was a way he could be seeing things wrong.
What is it?
Dad had descended halfway down the stairs while we'd been talking. I guess he felt left out. Pop didn't show a single sign of acknowledgement. Instead, he pushed the phone away. He didn't look at me while he spoke.
Parker, what did you do?
No, I didn't. Listen, we broke into Mrs. Hudson's...
You what?
Dad shouted from the stairs, storming down to meet us. His steps were heavier than usual, and his face was turning a shade of red that rivaled the jars of blood.
You broke into...
It's for a good reason, I swear, I said, my voice pleading. Dad, you have to look at these... Mr. Charles? Our family feud froze into a tableau. My arms outstretched, waving a cell phone through the air, Pop, his head in his hands, defeated, Dad, 1 foot in the air, about to clear the last step. Right. Melissa was still here. Her eyes were puffy and red, but any tears that might have been there had since been wiped away. "Can I stay here tonight? I don't feel safe walking home, and my parents can't pick me up this late." No one slept that night. Instead, we once again found ourselves back in the world's tensest living room. Melissa had missed out on it last time, but lucky for her, my parents made up for it. After several yelling matches, a series of expletives the likes of which I'd never heard before, and enough tears to fill a bathtub, my fathers were caught up on the whole story. Pop was seated in the chair this time. He had a hold of my phone, swiping through the pictures while Dad looked on over his shoulder. They spoke to each other too quietly for me to follow. This, I imagined, was not the sort of thing they taught you about in parenting class. Melissa and I sat side by side on the couch, both at a loss for words. She was still, save for the dead skin on her thumb she methodically picked away at. My right leg bounced like it was vital to my continued survival. The good news was that my dad seemed to believe us, about the blood in the hearts at least. They didn't really have a choice. I suppose there was a way this could have been some sick prank that Melissa and I were trying to pull, but my parents knew us well enough to know that that wasn't the case. The bad news was that they were still furious. The worst news was, "We have to call the police." I smiled faintly as Dad made his declaration. "Oh, turning in your own son, huh?" I shouldn't have been making jokes, but the adrenaline still pumping through my veins was absolutely intoxicating. Nothing felt real. "Parker, don't be a dick," Melissa mumbled next to me. My parents didn't acknowledge either comment. I leaned back into the soft leather of the couch and took a few slow breaths. I hadn't really had a moment to decompress until now, a break to really try and unpack all the shit I'd witnessed tonight. It had been a lot of shit. "You gonna tell the cops about the fucked up deer baby, Dad?" Dad grunted in response, and I wasn't sure if it was a yes, a no, or a warning to use better language. I didn't normally speak to him that way, but my mind was still reeling. I didn't ask again. The creature was the one thing I hadn't got a photo of, which was problematic because it was also by far the hardest to convince my dads about. Even now, I couldn't say for certain if they were taking my words at face value or if they were too stunned by the documented gore to protest. Pop looked pensive. It was hard to imagine what exactly he was thinking. I'd joked about them turning me in, but I couldn't imagine either one of my parents wanted me to go to juvie. At the same time, there was no way to move forward without telling somebody about Mrs. Hudson's garage. He cleared his throat. "We can't, David." "Excuse me? We can't go to the police. Not unless we have a way to justify how these photos were taken. I'm not going to condemn my son for..." He sputtered, his eyes popping as he grasped for the words. "For trying to figure out what the hell happened to Damien." He was on a tear now. If I wasn't so scared, I'd have been impressed. I sank further into the couch, hoping I wouldn't be dragged into the conversation. Besides, how useful do you think the police are going to be? If they weren't absolutely useless, we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. What kind of town are we living in where a 15-year-old... No, a pair of 15-year-olds are more committed to following up on a murder than the actual authorities? When he finished, the room went dead silent. Pin drop silence. I could feel the confusion and frustration coming off of Pop in waves. "Then what?" Dad finally responded, but Pop cut him off. I don't know.
Look, I know I said uninterrupted, but seriously, I need to remind you to support this author. Rose is incredibly talented and has more stories for you to enjoy on their Reddit page. You can also find them and follow them on Twitter at RoseKMorgan to keep up to date with everything they're doing. All right, I can hear you violently clicking the fast forward button on your VCR. Let's get back to the story.
We made pancakes. Normally I'm a pancake person. Pop and Dad keeps all sorts of berries and sauces and jams at the ready to top them off. When I was little, stacked on top of a pancake was basically the only way my dads could get me to eat fruit. I stared at the strawberry jam and gagged. I couldn't remember the last time I ate a pancake plain. As I ate, I wondered if they had always tasted like microwaved memory foam. Maybe I just hadn't noticed because of all the toppings. I didn't really want to eat, but the last meal I had was over 11 hours ago now, so I forced myself. Melissa wasn't trying as hard. She'd shredded her pancakes into little pieces with her fork, scattering them around the plate. Her eyes were glassy, yet her brow was furrowed. I watched her stab a piece of pancake just to scrape it back onto the plate. Post-pancakes, Dad walked back into the living room and turned on the news. He slumped down onto the couch, welding his eyes to the screen. I think he was hoping something about Mrs. Hudson's house would be on TV. Maybe a story saying someone had driven by, saw the garage open, and called the cops. That she'd been arrested, and the officers so overwhelmed by the horrors inside that the cut chain slipped their mind. No such luck. Pop was leaning next to the stove, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. He hadn't bothered asking anyone else if they wanted some. Drumming his fingers on the side of the mug, he spoke.
What if we posted the pictures online?
I dropped my fork, a piece of dry pancake still stuck on the end. Couldn't they be traced back to us? Pop shrugged. He wasn't the tech expert in the family. I have a better idea. We both turned to face Melissa as she spoke. I'll give them to my parents. You'll listen. Melissa's tone was serious. I've been trying to figure this out all morning, but I think I finally got it. Pop pulled up a chair next to Melissa, setting his tea down on the placemat. I'll print the photos out here. They won't be amazing quality since you just have a normal printer, but it should be good enough. I'll handle them with gloves to be extra safe. I'll put them in an envelope, address it to my parents, and put it in our mailbox myself. I can even type out a note saying where the photos were taken. She looked back and forth between us, waiting for a response. Hesitantly, I offered a criticism. The doorbell will be on the charger when I do it. She smiled, clearly satisfied with herself. The combination of her grin and her dark circles made the expression look much sadder than I believe she intended. I glanced over at Pop, and he seemed unconvinced. His tapping had moved from the mug to the tabletop. And how do you know they'll take it seriously? I felt my chest tense up as I pictured all the ways this could go wrong. One witness was all it would take. What if they think it's a prank or something? As I spoke, Melissa shook her head. Trust me, I know my parents. They're not going to pass up an opportunity like this. I looked at Pop. It was unspoken, but we all knew that unless we came up with something better, this was going to have to be our plan. We got to work. A lot of people wish they could spend the day on their couches watching TV. Dad was not one of them. As the sleepless Saturday morning had marched on, Dad had only left his post when absolutely necessary. He didn't want to pull himself away from the news, desperate to be the first to know if Mrs. Hudson's garage came up on the news. Every time I walked by him, he was in a slightly different position. He never looked comfortable. It took us about 20 minutes to assemble the envelope for Melissa using the computer and printer in Dad's office. We chose the clearest photos of the bunch and typed up a description of each one. She insisted we print the note in Courier New for some reason. I couldn't think of a reason not to, so we did. Melissa hadn't brought a bag of her own, so we needed to improvise something that wouldn't look suspicious on camera when she went home. We put the prepared envelope into a grocery bag, and we put that grocery bag into a second grocery bag, sandwiched between a pile of DVDs. If anyone asked, I loaned her the DVDs because I was tired of not being able to talk about my favorite movies with her. It helped that that was true. I mean, who still hasn't seen Pulp Fiction in 2015? Honestly. At about 9, Melissa decided it was time to go home. Pop offered to walk her home, but after a discussion, I ended up going instead. We thought it would be less suspicious, though Pop was reluctant to let the both of us outside without supervising. He brought his tea out onto the porch. When we'd reached her house, Melissa gave me a tight hug goodbye. I didn't want to let go, so I held tighter. Once it went from sweet to kind of awkward, faster than you'd hope, I let go. Text me, okay? Okay. She looked at me for a moment longer, like there was something she still wanted to say. Then the moment passed and she went inside. When I got home, Pop was standing on the porch. He must have been waiting this whole time while I was walking. He didn't say anything, and he didn't have to. I walked upstairs to my room, closing the door behind me. Collapsing onto my bed, I thought about sleeping. I closed my eyes. I see hearts in the freezer. I feel the weight of the jar of blood in my hand. For the first time in weeks, I see Damien. I didn't keep my eyes closed for long. I knew I needed to find some way to keep myself occupied for a while. My laptop would be a good bet, but the battery was dead and the charger nowhere to be found. I turned to the DVDs next, but obviously everything good was gone. I'd just given them to Melissa after all. Maybe a book, maybe I could... As my eyes made their way to the books, I had an idea. A stupid idea. Have you ever had one of those ideas? The kind that's so fucking stupid you feel embarrassed to even think it? You don't want to follow through on it, even if no one's watching, because it's so fucking stupid. I reached up and grabbed the milk crate of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons resources from the top of the bookshelf. God only knew the last time someone actually looked inside these books was. Damien, Melissa, and I had always told each other we'd get around to playing someday. I heaved the box onto the end of my bed, sitting down beside it. As I pulled out the books, there were some I immediately set aside. I didn't need the Player's Handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide. And there it was. Exactly what I was looking for. I didn't expect everything I read in the Monster Manual to be literally true. I was pretty sure that elves didn't exist, for one thing. When I started looking through the book, I was anxious to see if the thing from Mrs. Hudson's garage was listed. Whatever it was, I was confident it was the reason for Damien's death. Reading the Monster Manual had never been a more somber task than it was right then. As I leafed through the pages, I found myself slowing down and looking at all the god-awful pictures. Have you seen what a Gynosphinx looks like in the AD&D Monster Manual? Because it sure is something. The seriousness of my task started to fade away as I threw myself into ruthlessly criticizing decades-old fantasy art. I'd made it all the way from aerial servant to lynx giant when Pop knocked on my door. He asked me if I wanted anything, and I shook my head. He hesitated in the doorframe for longer than felt natural, but neither of us had anything to say. He left me to my own devices. I was leaning back on my pillow, dizzy from sleep deprivation, and, in spite of everything, laughing at the drawing of the owl bear when I noticed it. I bolted upright, my laughter stopping then and there like a jolt of electricity had just coursed through me. My hands felt weak and started to shiver slightly. It became more difficult to hold the book up, and I set it down on my legs. Holy shit. There it is. It's actually in here. On a second glance, the picture was not exactly what I'd seen in the garage. The creature, apparently called a periton, didn't have a set of front legs like the baby I'd seen. It also looked a hell of a lot less intimidating. It had angry little eyebrows on its stag face. Still, I was convinced that I had found it. A lot of the entry was just game mechanics, which really didn't matter to me. I read on, hoping at least some of what was written would be useful. Peritons dwell in rocky hills or mountainous regions, or garages. Its claws are too weak to use. Wow, something genuinely encouraging. Each periton attacks but a single creature, and when it is dead, the periton tears out the victim's heart with its teeth. Human hearts are the type most sought by peritons. My skin prickled at this passage. Thinking about someone getting their heart torn out made me all the more aware of my own beating in my chest. The more I thought about it, the more it sped up. It was mostly consistent with what I'd seen, except there was no mention of peritons storing hearts for later, or the screaming. I needed more information, and I needed Melissa. I searched the bed for my cell phone, even poking my head beneath to make sure it didn't fall under. It must be downstairs. And after I'd told Melissa to text me too. Whoops. I hurried down the stairs, jumping the few at the bottom out of habit. I turned and then hesitated in the doorway of the living room. Dad and Pop were seated side by side on the couch. Dad's elbows were on his knees, his hands together in front of him. He was leaning towards the TV as if he were magnetized. Pop was intensely focused too, his hand gripping Dad's shoulder. I couldn't tell if they'd even noticed me. It worked, Parker. Pop finally tore his eyes away from the TV to acknowledge me. Mrs. Hudson's been arrested.
Investigations are still ongoing at 78 Garside Avenue after the arrest of Mrs. Abigail Hudson earlier today. While few details have been released to the public so far, officials have indicated a possible connection to the January 12th death of 15-year-old Damien Allen. Officials have also confirmed that multiple items have been seized from the home, including a freezer. Their relevance is not currently known.
As the anchor spoke, a short clip played in the corner of Mrs. Hudson being escorted from her home in cuffs. The garage door was half open, pulled up just far enough to tell that when it was recorded, the freezer hadn't been removed yet. Melissa was back at my house as soon as she got the news. Her parents would be out all night at this rate. I tried to phone her, but she didn't want to talk about it over the phone. She said it was too suspicious, which I guess made sense. It was probably just as suspicious as talking about how you don't want to look suspicious, but I didn't tell her that. We left the TV blaring in the living room on the off chance that there were any more developments. Dad had ordered Chinese food, and the four of us crowded into the kitchen table to eat. With takeout containers scattered over the tabletop and my monster manual open so Melissa could see what I'd found, anyone looking in on us would have probably assumed we'd been having a great day. Surprisingly, Melissa was the polar opposite of what she'd been early that morning. She was revitalized. On her fifth chicken ball, she smiled at me. I told you it was a good plan. In spite of myself, I found her mood contagious. Her smile, her satisfaction that something had finally gone right seemed to light up the room. It was hard to believe neither of us had slept since we'd broken in. I broke into a grin as well. The memo about a good mood hadn't reached my parents, both of which remained on edge. Somewhere at the back of my mind, I had realized that I was probably going to get grounded until I moved out. But the surreal quality of everything I'd experienced had numbed the pain. With Hudson taken care of, Melissa and I had set our sights on the creature we'd seen. I showed her the entry in the monster manual, and the two of us had got to work Googling. Neither of my parents spoke as we gathered more information on the Periton, and part of me wondered if they still believed us. It wouldn't be beyond Dad and Pop to write off the whole thing as a trauma-induced hallucination, really. They were pretty understanding as far as parents went, but everyone has their limits. It turned out that the Periton was not the easiest beast to track down details on. A lot of sources contradicted each other, and we had no idea what to trust and what was just something someone had made up for the sake of a fantasy game. One universal truth about Peritons was the fact that they were deeply territorial and did not back down from challenges. This site here says that they cast a shadow the shape of a human being. Melissa squinted as she read from her phone. Yeah, so did this one. It said they cast a human shadow until their first kill. What? This one says they cast the shadow of their latest victim. At Melissa's response, I set my phone down on the table. I feel a twinge of frustration. Honestly, I don't give a damn what shaped shadow it casts. I didn't really spend much time looking at its shadow personally. Dad stood up, taking his dirty plate to the sink, steadfastly not acknowledging the conversation taking place. Melissa, I'll pull out the couch in the living room for you. Ugh, I'll clean up in the morning. Pop stretched his arms out in front of him. I'm not staying up any longer than I have to. Neither should you. He looked pointedly at me and Melissa. We said our goodbyes and headed to our respective beds. As I entered my room, I still felt energized. At a point when I almost certainly should have been tired, the euphoria from having one victory on my side still kept me awake. Tucking myself in, I turned on the TV. I knew it was bad for you to use them when you're trying to sleep, but just this once I thought I'd make an exception. The news was replaying the same clip about Mrs. Hudson. It looked like there still weren't any updates.
Officials have indicated a possible connection to the January 12th death of 15-year-old Damien Allen. Officials have also confirmed that multiple items have been seized from the home.
Wait a second. As the clip of Mrs. Hudson's arrest played, I hit pause. In the clip, the garage door was half open. You could still see the disgusting floors and the freezer in the back. What you couldn't see was the crate. She must have moved it. My mind and heart raced. If she'd moved the crate, did she know the police were coming? Where was the baby Periton now? It dawned on me that there'd been no mention of animals found at the crime scene. For that matter, where the fuck was the other one? Melissa and I hadn't got a clear view of it when we'd run home, but there was no doubt in my mind that it had been following us. Mrs. Hudson was raising them, sure, but her being arrested didn't mean we were safe. It didn't neutralize the threat. In the elation of Hudson's arrest, I hadn't really thought about how serious things still were. The Peritons were still out there, somewhere, except now we had no leads. I thought about running out of the room, grabbing Melissa and begging Dad to drive us all out of the city. I thought about calling 911 or at least animal control, warning someone about what I knew was out there. But countless hours without sleep was finally taking its toll on me. I rationalized that if the city had done fine in ignorance of the beast threatening it last night, it could hang on for a few more hours. I counted 2 stars before I was unconscious. I'm sitting up in bed. The TV is off, but I still hear it playing. I can't make out the words. It's like my head is underwater and the audio is coming from the shore. I stand up and check my watch, but I'm not wearing a watch. Who wears a watch to bed? Stupid. I reach toward my desk to grab my watch, but then I blink and I'm not in my bedroom anymore. Icy water is rushing over my feet, but they don't feel wet. Just cold. It smells like fresh flowers, though I don't see many. Just green grass. It's bright out here. I step out of the creek onto the bank and sit down next to Damien. His eyes are open, awake, alive. His shirt isn't bloody and stained. He's breathing slowly, calmly. He doesn't say anything for a few minutes, and neither do I. Minutes somehow turn into hours. It's quiet, but it's nice. I close my eyes, and I hear the creek below us. I feel the cold, hard rock underneath me. Something chirps in the distance. Something changes. The air feels heavier, thicker, like a thunderstorm is about to hit. I open my eyes and the sky looks different. Damien is no longer smiling. His eyes are widening and he scrambles backwards up off the rock. He screams. He screams like he's been mortally wounded and the world collapses into darkness around me. My eyes snapped open as my dream came to an end. I threw my covers onto the floor, leaping out of my bed in terror. I knew I was fully awake now, but that didn't calm my fears in the slightest. If anything, it made them worse. Because even though I was wide awake, I could still hear Damien screaming. My brain knew the screaming wasn't, it couldn't be, Damien's voice, but my heart felt differently. I'd heard that scream before. Years of failed stunts, bloody knees, and broken arms had made me familiar with it. I grasped for my remote, freezing the still playing TV signal. As suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I still hadn't figured out where it was coming from. In the moment of quiet, I held my breath. I heard frantic footsteps and a distant cry of "David" from the hallway, then silence. The glow of the paused TV was my only source of light. My face was flushed. The sides of my neck throbbed like the arteries were going to explode if I didn't take a breath. And the scratching started. Years ago, I'd had a bird stuck in my bedroom wall. It had woken me up in the middle of the night, gentle scratching right next to my head, pulling me out of my sleep. I'd ran to Dad, yelling my lungs out about the monster in my room. This time, the scratching was louder and it wasn't in the wall. I looked straight up as the sound of claws against shingles began. I wanted to run, but my body had frozen solid. The lump in my throat stopped me from screaming and the ice in my veins from trying to escape. The sounds, stripped of context, should not have been terrifying. It just sounded like an animal struggling to keep its balance on top of the roof. For a moment, the claws stopped scratching. I wondered what it was doing up there. It screamed again. The sound was like a red-hot knife being buried into my chest. It knocked the breath out of me, but melted the ice in my veins. I didn't understand, but somehow that was Damien's voice crying from my roof. I needed to move. If it was trying to break in, it was only a matter of time before it noticed the window. I left the room as quickly as I could, shutting the door behind me as I went.
I yelped as Pop nearly bowled me over. "Parker!" I grabbed Pop's arm. I hadn't realized how badly I was shaking until I actually saw my hands. "We have to go." "Your dad is getting the emergency bag now." Pop's voice wavered as he spoke, the quiver in his voice matching the one in my limbs. I could tell he was at his wit's end, but he wanted to look strong for me. It wasn't comforting. A new sound rang out above us, a heavy, repetitive thud, like someone was hitting the roof with 2 baseball bats. Losing my composure, I let out a short yelp and grabbed Pop, burying my head in his chest like a child. On a normal day, I'd have found it embarrassing, but I didn't have time for those thoughts now. "Shh." He held me there for a moment. When he let go, I wiped my eyes dry. "Go. Downstairs." I was in no mood to argue. Melissa and Dad stood by the door, already ready to go. Dad was stoic. He hid his emotions better than Pop, but the way his eyes darted around gave his fear away. Melissa said nothing. She was swaying very slightly from side to side. I thought she might have been in shock. The van wasn't far from the door, but getting there was still risky. Still, I think we all knew that we needed to drive if we wanted to have even the slightest chance of survival. There was nowhere good to hide here. Dad would go first. He had the best chance of making it to the van and unlocking the doors. Once it was open, the rest of us would go all at once to join him. He kissed Pop on the forehead and then opened the door. Watching Dad through the window made me feel like a lonely little kid, vulnerable, confused, terrified. I automatically held my breath as he ran, as if exhaling too loud would break a spell, put him at risk. He made it. My relief was only momentary as another scream sounded from the top floor, followed by the shattering of glass. It was in the house now. Without discussion, we took that as our cue to leave. My feet hit the pavement of the driveway hard, and I almost couldn't open the van's door thanks to the sweat coating my hands. Melissa was the last to get in, joining me in scrambling into the back row of seats out of habit. Before the door was even shut, Dad had started to back quickly out of the driveway. Another scream rang out. I scrunched up my face, closing my eyes as tight as I could. It was agonizing to hear Damien's voice coming from that beast. We had just started down the road when Melissa grabbed my hand. She squeezed it tightly and I gingerly opened my eyes. I thought she needed emotional support or something. I know I certainly did. But her grip got tighter, to the point where her nails dug into my skin. Ow! Hey! Melissa turned and with her other hand pointed out the back window. It was the first time we had actually seen the adult Periton, and it was gaining on us. The baby had been disturbing enough, but this, it looked like it belonged on a metal album cover. The front of the beast was jet black, save for some light gray fur on its muzzle. Its antlers were larger than any I'd ever seen on a deer and looked almost beautiful. Smooth and slick, they glistened like polished onyx, like part of a statue. They didn't look fuzzy or natural. I couldn't quite see its eyes from here, but they looked pale. The wings that moved the Periton forward were powerful. As it passed each lamppost, they shone with hues of dark green, navy, and purple, iridescent like a rooster's tail. Worst of all, it didn't even seem to be trying hard to catch up. There was a calm, methodical beating to its wings. It wasn't exerting much energy, but it was gaining on us. With each calm stroke, the distance between the Periton and our van narrowed. It opened its mouth to scream again, revealing a series of jagged, thorny teeth. It was easy to see them in sickening detail as they were backlit by a subtle red glow. As the beast that had stolen Damien's voice used it again, I watched the glow in its throat intensify. I decided that I'd had enough. I yanked my hand away from Melissa and sank down into my seat. I crossed my arms tightly across my body as though, if I used enough pressure, I could squeeze the fear and nausea right out. It didn't work. A moment passed in relative quiet as I stared at the plastic mat on the floor. I heard Melissa mumble quietly to herself. I wasn't sure if she was thinking out loud or praying. Melissa wasn't particularly religious, but this seemed as good a moment as any to give prayer a shot. The car jerked to the right, turning onto another residential street. I assumed Dad was trying to shake the Periton, but I couldn't bring myself to check to see if it was working. "David, faster."
I glanced up at the front passenger seat to see Pop staring out the back window, his voice shaking. "David, we have to." The ending of Pop's sentence was lost in a cacophony of screaming. Mine, Melissa's, and the Perriton's. The car lurched violently to the left as we were struck. The first attack threw us off course, and Dad desperately tried to regain control of the vehicle. The second attack pierced the glass. Melissa dove forward, narrowly avoiding a claw to the back of the skull. She fumbled for her seatbelt latch, and I did the same. I felt a cut from my face where a shard of glass had hit me. The Perriton backed off for a moment, giving me enough time to help boost Melissa up to the middle row of seats. Before I could climb after her, I felt my body jerk backwards. Instinctively, my hands flew up to my throat, which was now being compressed by the collar of my shirt. Somehow, horns and all, the Perriton had crammed its head through the broken back window and grabbed a hold of my shirt with its teeth. I tried to wiggle free, but it had too strong of a grip. "Parker!" Melissa's voice was strained. From the seat in front of me, she tried to grab my leg and pull me back down. She wasn't strong enough. The Perriton pulled me back, my legs slipping from Melissa's hands entirely. It dragged me backwards out and through the shattered remains of the window. The glass stalagmites tore my shirt and back to ribbons. The pain was searing. I could have screamed if I weren't still choking from the pressure on my neck. The van shot forward as Dad tried to get away, and suddenly, I was completely out of the vehicle. I'm sure the Perriton was strong enough to hold me in the air, but it dropped me on the ground. I landed flat on my back, dirt and gravel grinding their way into my open wounds. I gasped for air, the pressure finally off of my neck. Somewhere in the distance, Melissa and my parents were shouting each other. I was already too dizzy to focus on what they were saying. Drenched in blood and sweat, I couldn't breathe properly. I coughed and gagged, the overpowering taste of iron filling my mouth. The black stag's head leered over me. I could see now that the Perriton's eyes were pale blue, with the tiniest of black pinpricks of pupils at their centers. Its chest expanded and contracted slowly, and I found myself inadvertently matching the pattern, calming my panic sputtering. I closed my eyes. The fear drained out of my body, and I started to go numb. I didn't think I'd be awake for much longer, but I didn't mind anymore. Around me, the world was quiet. The ground felt soft under me, like a bed. A breeze brushed across my chest. It kind of tickled, and I smiled. For a moment, I felt serene. I guess this is what happened to Damien then. I don't know how or why, but this single thought ruins it. Recognizing that my serenity is an illusion instantly breaks me from it. The ground is hard, the world is loud, and the Perriton's teeth are digging into my chest. I didn't even have the presence of mind to think, I'm about to die. I couldn't hear my own frenzied gasps of pain over my sternum being cracked, snapped into pieces. My hands contorted as I tried desperately to cope with the agony. More than anything, I wanted it to be over, but it wouldn't end. I felt the teeth suddenly tear away from my chest, taking an ungodly amount of skin with them. I blearily watched the blood-soaked mouth rise away from me. Something had distracted it. My heart was still beating inside my chest, 1,000 miles a minute. The van's headlights washed over my body, still writhing in the middle of the street. Unlike a typical deer in the headlights, the Perriton didn't stay still for long. It walked forward, confidently striding towards the light, challenging the van to come closer. But the van didn't come closer. It reversed. Incensed by the lights, the Perriton walked forward. It looked as if it was battling the van for dominance, its icy glaze locked on the headlights like the eyes of a mortal enemy. It lowered its head, letting out quiet snarls as it advanced. Slowly but surely, the beast was drawn further away from where I lay bleeding. After a few meters of this dance, the van shot forward. Realizing its mistake, the Perriton leapt into the air, but not soon enough. Its body was splayed across the windshield, then dragged underneath. One last time, I heard that awful sound. Damien's voice screaming bloody murder. But as soon as it began, it was cut short. I would have joined in screaming if I'd had the ability, but by then I was already too far gone. The van's tires ground to a stop just a few feet from my head. I couldn't see the beast's condition from where I lay. The ambulance didn't take long to arrive, or so I was told. I was blacked out long before the first shriek of the sirens. Lucky didn't even begin to cover my situation, the doctors told me. The lacerations on my back, while painful, weren't as deep as I'd originally believed. The deer bite to my chest was deep, and my broken sternum served to prove that, but sheer adrenaline had kept me alive long enough to get medical attention. It was a miracle, they had said, that I'd just happened to have a rabies vaccine administered the year before, or else I would have been fucked. I may be paraphrasing. I tried to tell them that I'd never been vaccinated for rabies, but they said I was probably just delirious from the meds. That was the last they'd hear about it, no matter how much I tried to protest. The Puritan's body was taken away by animal control shortly after I'd blacked out. They called it a deer carcass, but Dad says he could tell by the look in the staff's eyes that they didn't really know what they were dealing with, and they were too afraid to try and find out. Melissa and I went to visit Mrs. Hudson when I'd recovered enough that a coughing fit didn't cause me agonizing pain. My dads had protested. They didn't think it was good for me. Miss Cody, my therapist, wasn't sure if I would be ready or not, but emphasized to all of us that ultimately this would be my decision. I'd never been to prison before, but Melissa had. Her parents had taken her on a tour of one when she was younger. Her dad took her a few times, actually, whenever he was the one running the tour and didn't have anyone to watch her. Just getting in to visit Mrs. Hudson was uncomfortable. Not only did we need to be screened and put on a list to even be allowed in, we had to give a compelling reason why we wanted to visit her. Eventually, we said we wanted to offer her forgiveness for her role in Damien's death, even though the case was ongoing and she hadn't yet been found guilty. I guess we got a sappy prison guard because he thought it was a good enough reason. We sat at the table across from Mrs. Hudson. For whatever reason, they didn't bother putting her on the other side of glass. As far as anyone knew, the woman was a serial killer, but she still wasn't considered a high-risk inmate. Her silvery hair was short but matted on the sides. Her skin sagged like it was about to fall right off her face and onto the floor. Her arms and neck were scarily thin, and I thought there was a chance they might snap in half if she moved too fast. Part of me really wanted to test it. We know about the Puritans. I figured there was no reason to beat around the bush. The pardon? A tangled mess of extra wrinkles appeared across her forehead and circled her eyes. Her confusion seemed genuine. I pulled my shirt collar down, exposing the top of the scar on my chest. I looked like a patchwork doll, the combination of my scarred skin and the areas where it was so brutal that I needed a donor. It didn't look like a bite mark exactly, but I knew for a fact that Hudson would know how I got it. The guard in the corner furrowed his brow and looked like he was about to walk over to us, so I let it go. He stopped. Oh. Mrs. Hudson's face split into a smile, showing off her few remaining teeth. Her face was more fit for a bingo winner than a murderer. My dear friends. I call them that because, yeah, I get it. Cute. Melissa didn't laugh at what Mrs. Hudson apparently thought was a very clever comment. We all lapsed into a deeply uncomfortable silence. I couldn't bring myself to be the one to break it. It is truly shameful, you know. Mrs. Hudson looked mournfully down at the table. She sighed, a twinge of softness to her voice. You see, I did all I could to try and limit the unpleasantness of it all. Unconsciously, I shifted closer to Melissa. Explain. I went with folks who weren't likely to make the news and all that. She paused, thinking of a way to put it delicately. Now, at first, I'd just let the deer help themselves, but that was before the baby. Either of you ever have a dog? Melissa shook her head, but I just stared. The thing with some animals is that they just don't know when to stop. Dogs are just awful for it. You leave a bag of kibble on the floor and they'll just go to town. Deer are the same way. If we go out to get them some food, once they've started, they're liable to just keep eating, and that's not healthy. So, responsible pet owner that I am, I train them to back off. They'll do whatever it is they do to calm the person down. Then I'd take what we needed and put it away for later. It was cleaner when I did it anyway. I tried to push the image of Mrs. Hudson lovingly hand-feeding a human heart to the Puritan out of my head, but it wouldn't leave. It made me lightheaded. The confidence I had walking into the prison had completely evaporated. It was all I could do to keep breathing steadily. We'd come here for answers, but now all I wanted was to tell her to stop talking. Your boy was different, though. When he broke in, he spooked the deer. I wasn't down fast enough to stop it getting into him the old-fashioned way. I heard a slight gasp from Melissa next to me. Even though we'd already known, it was hard to hear. I made the deer drop it. They respect me pretty well by now, but it had mangled him something fierce by then. I just couldn't stop him, though. She smiled fondly as she spoke. I knew Liz Allen from church. Sweet lady. I don't want her to worry over nothing. I looked over to the guard. Clearly, his mind was somewhere else. The fact that he wasn't paying attention to this conversation mattered little, considering the video camera mounted on the wall. Everything Mrs. Hudson said was caught on tape. She had to know that. Oh, I know about the cameras. I'm not that ignorant, son. It was like she was reading my mind, though I know she had just followed my gaze. I just don't much care anymore. She leaned towards me, bringing her voice down. You honestly think I'm going to be around long enough for it to make a difference? I stood up. I tried to think of something, anything to say to her, but I couldn't find the words. I could tell her to go to hell or that she was a monster. I could tell her that I didn't understand why she'd done it or why she valued human lives less than her stupid fucking deer friends. I could ask her if she had any idea the magnitude of suffering she had brought to this community or if she even cared. Instead, I said nothing at all. So, where is it then? Melissa was still seated. She hadn't spoken for a while, and when she did, her voice was quiet and strained. I just told you, I'm not that ignorant. You think I'm just going to tell you where the others are? Not going to happen, young lady. Mrs. Hudson was sentenced to life, which in her case worked out to about 6 months. Turns out you can't just throw someone her age into a standard prison and expect them to last. A more thorough investigation of her home had turned up innumerable bodies buried in her backyard. Why they hadn't checked there to begin with baffles me. The general public obsessed for about 2 weeks when the newscasters finally revealed the details of the garage. I had to act surprised at school when the other kids brought it up. 5 human hearts in her freezer? Like, what the fuck? Why did she keep them? The girl next to me in French had asked, eyes nearly bulging out of her head. I don't know, maybe like cult stuff? I tried to act the part, but I knew I didn't sound as interested as she did. She frowned at me and I shrugged. Rituals or whatever? Maybe. She tapped her pencil on her lips. Hey, do you remember how geographic prepositions work again? I didn't. Anyone who's been through a tragedy can tell you that life afterwards isn't ever quite right. It's not that you're never happy again, it's just palpably different. Not a day goes by where things feel the same way that they used to, but you adjust and keep going. You have to. You don't have any other choice. At home, it was weird for a while. I think my parents were genuinely stumped about what to do with me. They could ground me all they wanted, but I think they figured I'd been through enough. I didn't need to be grounded when I already had the wonderful twin punishments of PTSD and never being able to take my shirt off in front of someone without sending them running and screaming. Mostly, we tried not to talk about it, but it wasn't that they were trying to hide from each other. We just didn't have anything left to say. In time, the elephant left the room. I stayed in therapy. Different things work for different people, and CBT worked for me. There's definitely a part of me that still blames Damien's death on myself. Every time I remember our last conversation, it still makes me queasy. I don't think that part of me will ever go away, but in therapy, I've learned how to argue with it. Most of the time, I win. Melissa and I applied for our hunting licenses on her 16th birthday. I'm a few months younger than she is, but you're allowed to get one at 15 with written parental consent. My dads weren't thrilled about it, but in all honesty, Melissa and I weren't thrilled about it either. Neither of us liked the idea of hunting, but we weren't really applying for fun. It feels tacky to write it, but I know Damien wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life regretting instead of living. And I intend to keep on living.
Welcome back, my darling deviants. Oh, I do so hope you enjoyed this story and that you'll think twice about going around breaking and entering from now on. I mean, who knows what you might find packed away in some timid old lady's house? Curtains? A Winnebago? A portal to an evil alternate dimension that my cousin Henry violently brought forth because he's a sociopath? The possibilities are endless. Anyways, be sure to eviscerate that subscribe button and ring that little bell so that you're notified the moment we upload a new video. We'll see you next time, kiddos. Until then, my ghastly gang, stay spooky.